The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Confederation hummed with tension. 12 species had gathered, each more advanced than the last, their representatives seated around a massive circular table that glowed with soft blue light. Above them, holographic displays showed the approaching threat. The Void Swarm, a dark mass of interconnected entities that had already consumed 3 star systems. Commander Tom Wilson stood tall despite being the shortest delegate in the room. His human frame looked fragile next to the armored Drex, or the towering Altari, but his voice remained steady. "The data is clear," Wilson said, pointing to the projection. "The swarm adapts to each attack we throw at it. Our best option is a coordinated evacuation of the outer systems while we prepare defensive positions in depth." A rumble of disapproval swept through the chamber. General Cruel of the Drex slammed his metallic fist on the table. "Typical human response," Cruel growled. "Always retreat, always hide. The Drex will meet this enemy head-on, as warriors should." The elegant Altari representative, Director Lom, adjusted her shimmering robes. "We agree with the Drex, though for different reasons. Our analytical models show a 78% chance of success. If we strike now with our newest weapons, the human proposal would damage trade routes and cause needless panic." Wilson tried again. "With respect, Director, your models don't account for the swarm's rate of adaptation. If we fail in a direct assault." "If we fail," interrupted the Nelvari delegate, his third eye glowing with disdain, "it will not be because the strategy was wrong, but because some species," he looked directly at Wilson, "lacked the resolve to execute it properly." Whispers and nods of agreement followed. The humans had been part of the Confederation for only 30 years, the newest and least advanced members. Their cautious approach to space exploration and their defensive military doctrine had earned them a reputation throughout the galaxy. The cowards of space, some called them, though rarely to their faces. Wilson exchanged glances with his aide, Lieutenant Peyton. They had expected this response, but had hoped the severity of the threat might overcome old prejudices. "I remind the Council," Wilson said, "that during the Proxima conflict, our defensive strategy saved your own colonies while letting the Centauri outposts fall," finished General Cruel. "We remember." The Confederation president, a wise old Thelm with skin like polished marble, raised a hand for quiet. "We have heard the human concerns. They are noted. However, the majority position is clear. The Confederation will meet this swarm with our united fleet, the mightiest armada ever assembled." The president's eyes softened as they met Wilson's. "Commander, we value the human contribution. Your ships will form the rear guard of our formation. Your particular talents for withdrawal may prove useful if circumstances require adjustment of our plans." Polite laughter rippled through the chamber. Wilson kept his face neutral, though Peyton's cheeks flushed red. "As the Council wishes," Wilson replied, bowing slightly. "We will take our assigned position." As the meeting adjourned, Wilson and Peyton walked slowly back to the human embassy. The massive shapes of warships filled the sky above them, already gathering for the great battle to come. "They're not ready," Peyton said quietly. "The swarm doesn't fight like anything they've faced before." Wilson nodded. "I know. Send the coded message to Earth Command. Tell them to begin Phase 1 of Operation Fallback." "Sir, the Confederation hasn't authorized." "No," Wilson said grimly. "They haven't. But when those ships come flying back with the swarm right behind them, someone needs to be ready. And as usual, Lieutenant, it seems that someone will have to be us." Captain Lisa Reed stood on the bridge of the UES Sentinel, her eyes fixed on the main screen. The human diplomatic vessel hung back at the designated rear position of the Confederation Armada, exactly where the Council had placed them, far from glory, far from the front lines. Reed didn't mind. The view was still spectacular, if terrifying. "Magnificent, isn't it?" her first officer, Jones, whispered. The Confederation fleet stretched out before them, Over 2,000 warships representing the greatest military force ever assembled in the galaxy. The Drex battle cruisers led the formation, their hulls bristling with weapons. Behind them came the sleek Altari vessels, their silver surfaces rippling with energy fields. The Nelvari ships pulsed with psychic amplifiers, ready to confuse and disorient the enemy. Reed nodded but remained silent. The 20 human ships in the fleet seemed small and plain by comparison. "They're making contact with the swarm," announced the communications officer. "Bringing it up now." The screen shifted to show the edge of the Taurus Nebula, where the darkness seemed deeper than the surrounding space. Then the darkness moved. The void swarm emerged like ink spreading through water, a mass of connected entities that seemed both solid and fluid. Parts of it resembled ships, others looked like massive creatures, and some sections defied description altogether. "All Confederation vessels. This is Supreme Commander Brock. We engage on my mark," came the transmission. Reed gripped the edge of her console. "All hands, defensive positions, shields at maximum." Jones gave her a curious look. "Captain, we're well out of range." "For now," Reed replied. On screen, the front line of the Armada opened fire. Thousands of energy beams struck the swarm simultaneously, cutting through its outer layers. A cheer went up from crews across the fleet. The celebration lasted exactly 8 seconds. The swarm's response was immediate and devastating. It flowed around the energy attacks, separated and reformed. Then it struck back. Hundreds of swarm tendrils shot forward, latching onto Drex ships. Where they touched, metal began to dissolve. They're absorbing the ships," Jones said in horror. Reed was already moving. "Communications, send emergency signal Alpha to all human vessels. Navigation, plot intercept courses for those Nelvari cruisers on the port flank. They are taking heavy damage." "Captain, we haven't received orders tow." "We're not waiting for orders," Reed snapped. "The front line is collapsing." On the screen, the proud Confederation Armada was in chaos. The swarm had penetrated their formation, adapting to each weapon used against it. The massive Drex flagship exploded in a ball of light as its power core was breached. Finally, the command came through. "All vessels, this is Supreme Commander Brock. Fall back. Repeat, fall back." But for many, it was too late. The swarm had encircled whole sections of the fleet. "Sentinel to all human ships. Rebroadcast. Execute Rescue Protocol Baker. Defensive screens on rotating frequencies." The 20 human vessels, once mocked for their excessive defensive capabilities, surged forward into the battle. Unlike the specialized warships of other species, human vessels were built with redundant systems and multiple defensive layers, a design philosophy born from humanity's long history of brutal warfare. The Sentinel shuddered as it took fire, but its shields held. Reed's crew worked with practiced efficiency, extending their defensive field around a damaged Altari cruiser and pulling it freed from the swarm's grasp. Across the battlefield, human ships did the same, darting in where the swarm's tendrils were thinnest, rescuing stranded crews, covering retreating vessels with their specialized point defense systems. "Captain, we've reached capacity," Jones reported. 243 survivors aboard from 6 different species. Reed nodded grimly. "Signal the other human ships. We've done what we can. Set course for the fallback point." As the Sentinel turned away from the devastation, Reed watched the once mighty Confederation Armada scattered and burning against the backdrop of space. The swarm, barely damaged, continued its inexorable advance toward populated worlds. "They called us cowards," Jones said quietly. "They can call us whatever they want," Reed replied, "as long as they're alive to say it." The Confederation Council chamber had lost its grandeur. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of the delegates. Many seats remained empty, their representatives lost in the disastrous first encounter with the Void Swarm. Admiral Jack Miller stood before them, his weathered face showing no satisfaction despite being proven right. Beside him, a holographic display labeled Operation Fallback rotated slowly. "The swarm will reach the Proxima sector in 9 days," Miller said, his voice calm but firm. "Centauri colonies 3 days after that. We need to begin full-scale evacuation immediately." General Krull of the Drex, his armor now dented and scorched, rose from his seat. One of his 4 arms hung limp at his side. "You expect us to run?" he growled. "We lost ships, yes, but we can rebuild." "Strike again with—" "With what?" interrupted Director Lom of the Altari. Her elegant robes were gone, replaced by a simple uniform. "We lost 60% of our fleet. The swarm adapted to our phased matter weapons in seconds." The chamber erupted into arguments. Species accused each other of tactical failures or technological shortcomings. The president called repeatedly for order, but desperation had replaced diplomatic protocol. Miller waited until the noise subsided, then touched a control on his wrist. The hologram expanded to show a complex network of evacuation routes, defensive positions, and supply caches. "This is Operation Fallback," he explained. "A comprehensive plan for evacuating 13 billion people from the threatened systems while establishing layered defenses to slow the swarm's advance." The Nelvari delegate's third eye narrowed. "When was this plan created, Admiral?" 5 years ago, Miller answered. "Updated continuously since then." Murmurs spread through the chamber. The film president leaned forward. "You've been preparing for this scenario for 5 years. Without council authorization." Miller stood straighter. "With respect, Madam President, we didn't need authorization to develop contingency plans. Every human military outpost and colony has similar protocols. It's standard procedure for us." "Standard procedure to assume defeat," General Krull spat. "Standard procedure to prepare for all outcomes," Miller corrected. "The first battles of Earth's history were won by those with the strongest warriors. The last were won by those with the best fallback positions and supply lines." Director Lom studied the hologram with new interest. "These evacuation routes, they utilize existing trade corridors, but with added security checkpoints. And these supply caches, you've already established them." Miller nodded. "Yes. Disguised as routine outposts or research stations. So while we built weapons," the Altari director said slowly, "you built lifeboats and bunkers and emergency broadcast systems and civilian training programs," Miller added. "Our colonies have been running evacuation drills quarterly. We can move our entire population to safe zones within 72 hours. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The human preparations, once seen as evidence of cowardice, suddenly appeared as foresight. An aide rushed into the chamber and whispered urgently to the president. The old Theln's marble-like skin paled visibly. "We've just received updated tracking data," the president announced. "The swarm has increased velocity. It will reach populated systems in 4 days, not 9. Panic flashed across the faces of the delegates, but Miller simply nodded and adjusted his hologram. "We anticipated this possibility. If we begin now and utilize all available ships, including repurposed cargo vessels, we can still complete the primary evacuations." General Krull stood again, but the hostility had left his stance. "You planned for even this." "We planned for worse," Miller said simply. The film president looked around the chamber, then fixed her gaze on Miller. "Admiral, the Confederation Council grants emergency powers to the human delegation to implement Operation Fallback, effective immediately." As delegates rushed to transmit orders to their worlds, Director Lom approached Miller privately. "Why?" she asked. "Why prepare so thoroughly for defeat when the rest of us prepared for victory?" Miller's eyes reflected the emergency lights. "We don't see it as preparing for defeat, Director. On Earth, we learned a painful lesson across thousands of years of warfare." "What lesson?" "That survival itself is victory," Miller said. "Everything else is just pride." Major Marcus Thompson wiped sweat from his brow as he stared up at the massive grain silos of Nivis Prime. The agricultural world was the breadbasket for 3 neighboring systems, and evacuating it properly would determine whether millions of refugees would eat in the coming months. "They still refuse to leave," said Lieutenant Park, returning from her meeting with the Nebulian elders. "They say the harvest cycle cannot be interrupted." Thompson sighed. The tall, willowy Nebulians were known for their agricultural skills and their stubborn adherence to traditions that dated back thousands of years. "Show me the map again," he ordered. A holographic display appeared, showing Nibis and the projected path of the Void Swarm. "The swarm will be here in 72 hours, Thompson said, pointing to the closest blue settlement. "We don't have time for cultural sensitivity training." He marched toward the central chamber where the Nebulian Council of Elders had gathered. Their elongated heads turned in unison as he entered, their skin shifting from green to a distrustful yellow. "Honored elders," Thompson began, bowing low as their customs required. "I understand your concerns for the harvest, but there will be no one left to eat if we don't move quickly." The chief elder, Tal, rose to his full 3-meter height. "The humans speak of running when they should speak of fighting. Our ancestors have tended these fields for 10,000 years. We will not abandon them." Thompson had expected this response. Without a word, he activated a small projector. The horrifying footage from the battle played out. Confederation ships being consumed, worlds going dark as the swarm passed. "With respect, Elder Tal, your ancestors never faced this," Thompson said quietly. "Neither had mine. But humans have always planned for the worst while hoping for the best." He pressed another button, and the projection changed to show a detailed plan of a massive biodome. "This is the emergency agricultural facility we built in the Epsilon system 3 years ago. Your seed banks can be transferred there. Your cultivation methods can continue. Your people can survive. And when we find a way to defeat the swarm, you can return." The elders stared at the projection, their skin slowly shifting to thoughtful blue. "You built this before the swarm was even discovered?" asked Elder Tal. "Yes, we build shelters before the storm, not during it," Thompson replied. "It's the human way." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out as human personnel led evacuation efforts. On the manufacturing hub of Taurus II, engineer Kate Foster worked frantically to modify refugee transports. "The shield harmonics need to be randomized," she instructed the skeptical Taurian engineers. "The swarm adapts to consistent energy patterns." The head engineer, a burly 4-armed Taurian named Dax, crossed all 4 arms. "These modifications waste power. Our shield designs are superior to human technology." Foster didn't look up from her work. "Your shields are stronger, yes. But the swarm doesn't care about strength. It cares about patterns it can analyze and penetrate." She finished wiring a circuit and sealed the panel. The Drex had the strongest shields in the Confederation. Didn't help them much, did it? Dax uncrossed his arms. "Show me these modifications again." Foster smiled. "Progress." In orbit above the ocean world of Aquaria, Commander Ryan Alvarez supervised the loading of massive submarines, an unusual choice for space evacuation. "The Aquarians can't survive standard transport conditions," he explained to the confused Confederation observer. "These submersibles maintain their required pressure and water chemistry." "But where did you get submersible vessels equipped for space transport?" the observer asked. "Such specific equipment." Alvarez shrugged. "Standard human contingency supplies. We maintain evacuation equipment for every allied species, even though no one asked you to." "Especially because no one asked us to," Alvarez replied. "Everyone's so busy planning how to win that they forget to plan for what happens if they don't." As the massive submarine transports filled with Aquarian families, Alvarez received an update from command. The swarm had accelerated again. They had even less time than they thought. He looked at the thousands of civilians being processed through the evacuation centers built by humans years ago and dismissed as unnecessary precautions by the very people now rushing through them to safety. Sometimes, he muttered to himself, "It pays to be the galaxy's warriors." Colonel Ben Harris gazed out at his small fleet positioned near Helios Prime. 37 ships in total, 17 human vessels, and 20 allied ships crewed by volunteers. Against the Void Swarm, it seemed like nothing more than a token force. "Status report," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the weight of his decision. Lieutenant Mason looked up from her console on the bridge of the UES Defiant. "All ships in position, sir. Evacuation transports from Helios Prime are 62% complete. They need 3 more hours to finish loading civilians." Harris nodded. Helios Prime, with its strategic position at the junction of 7 major trade routes, was the last evacuation point before the safe zones. If the swarm reached it before the civilians escaped, millions would die. "The swarm will be here in 30 minutes, said Commander Ortiz, pointing to the dark mass approaching on the sensors. "We can't stop it." "We don't need to stop it," Harris replied. "We just need to slow it down." He opened a channel to the assembled fleet. Faces appeared on the screen: human, Alteri, Drex, Nelvari, and others. All volunteers, all knowing exactly what they were facing. "This isn't a battle we can win conventionally," Harris told them. "Our objective is simple. Buy time. 3 hours. That's what we need to give those transports." He pulled up a tactical display. "The swarm moves as a connected entity. We'll use Phase 1 of Operation Fracture, hit and run attacks to split their formation. Don't engage directly for more than 60 seconds. Keep moving. Keep them confused." A Drex commander, his face scarred from the first battle, spoke up. "This is not how warriors fight. This is how you survive to fight again," Harris finished for him. "The Drex are proud warriors, Commander. Today, I need you to be clever warriors." The Drex's mandibles clicked thoughtfully before he nodded. "Swarm entering weapons range in 5 minutes," Mason announced. Harris studied the faces on his screen. "I won't lie to you. Some of us won't make it back, but every minute we buy saves thousands of lives." He straightened. "To your stations. For those we protect." "For those we protect," came the solemn reply across dozens of ships. The Void Swarm appeared like a black tide at the edge of the Helios system. Sensors struggled to define its exact shape as it shifted and flowed through space. "Execute Phase 1, Harris ordered. The small fleet split into attack groups of 3 ships each. They darted toward the swarm from different angles, firing precise bursts at its thinner sections before rapidly changing course. At first, the swarm reacted as expected, sending tendrils to capture the attacking ships. But the small vessels were quick, breaking off before the swarm could lock onto them. Gradually, sections of the swarm began to separate, chasing different targets. "It's working," Mason said. "The swarm is fracturing." Harris watched as the coordinated dance continued. The human ships led each attack group, their maneuvers drawing on centuries of Earth's naval warfare tactics. The Allied vessels followed their lead with growing confidence. First casualty, Ortiz reported grimly as one of the Alteri ships failed to evade fast enough. The swarm engulfed it in seconds. Harris kept his face composed. "Continue the operation. Shift to Phase 2. The remaining ships began more complex maneuvers, using Helios Prime's 3 moons as shields and firing decoy drones to further confuse the swarm. The massive entity struggled to coordinate its now separated sections, its usual fluid grace becoming jerky and reactive. "Evacuation transports at 85%, Mason updated. "They need another hour." An alarm blared. A swarm tendril had broken through their screen and was heading directly toward the evacuation lanes. "Defiant will intercept," Harris said, already moving toward the tactical station. "Continue the operation." The UES Defiant broke formation and accelerated toward the escaping tendril. Harris knew they didn't have the firepower to destroy it, but they could distract it. "All power to engines," he ordered. "We need to get its attention." The ship shuddered as it pushed beyond safe speeds. They passed directly in front of the tendril, firing all weapons. As Harris had hoped, the swarm section changed course to follow them. "Take us through the asteroid field," Harris commanded. "Let's see how well it can follow us through there." For the next 40 minutes, the remaining ships continued their carefully orchestrated dance of distraction. One by one, more ships fell to the swarm, but each sacrifice bought precious time. "Evacuation complete," Mason finally announced, her tired face breaking into a smile. "All transports away and clear." Harris allowed himself a brief moment of relief before turning to the remnants of his fleet. "All ships, prepare for emergency jump to fallback point Alpha. We've done our job here." As the surviving ships regrouped for the jump to safety, Harris looked back at the fractured swarm still struggling to reunite its sections. For the first time since the crisis began, the Confederation had achieved something against the enemy. Not a victory, but a successful delay. And it had come through tactics the galaxy had long mocked humans for: caution, misdirection, and the willingness to retreat. Dr. Anna Wright hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her eyes burned as she stared at the data scrolling across multiple screens in the underground research bunker. Around her, a team of scientists from various species worked in grim silence, all aware that their findings might be the last hope for the Confederation. "Play it again," Wright said, rubbing her temples. "Slower this time." The screen showed footage from the battle at Helios Prime. The Void Swarm's movements, once fluid and coordinated, became erratic when Colonel Harris' fleet split its attention. "There," Wright pointed. "Freeze it." The image stopped, showing 5 separate tendrils of the swarm reaching in different directions. "They never fully reconnected," she murmured, "even after our ships withdrew." An Alteri scientist, Dr. Tev, looked up from his own analysis. "The fragmentation is temporary. Our models show the swarm will reform completely within 12 hours. But it shouldn't need 12 hours, Wright insisted. The swarm processes information instantly. Why the delay?" She pulled up another file, a detailed scan of a small swarm fragment recovered during the retreat from Helios. The fragment had died once separated from the main body, but its cellular structure remained intact for study. "Look at these neural pathways," Wright said. "They're designed for single-stream processing, incredibly fast, but only in one direction at a time." Dr. Tev frowned. "That contradicts our understanding. The swarm processes multiple attacks simultaneously." "No," Wright said, excitement building in her voice. "It processes them sequentially, just extremely quickly. But if we could force it to handle too many contradictory inputs at once." She stood abruptly and moved to a central console, pulling up the Confederation database on swarm encounters. "Every time we've damaged the swarm, it's been when it faced something unexpected," she explained. "The randomized shields Engineer Foster implemented on the refugee ships, the erratic maneuvers at Helios Prime. The swarm can adapt to any pattern, but it struggles with chaos." Dr. Tev still looked skeptical. "Even if your theory is correct, how does this help us? We cannot match the swarm's strength." "We don't need to match its strength," Wright replied. "We need to overload its processing capacity." She called up a new display showing the human defensive network that had been established throughout Confederation space. Thousands of automated beacons and relay stations. "These were originally designed as early warning systems," Wright explained. "But we can reprogram them to broadcast contradictory signals, hundreds of thousands of them simultaneously." Understanding dawned on Dr. Tev's face. A confusion matrix. Force the swarm to process so many contradictory inputs that it cannot form a unified response. "Exactly," Wright nodded. "Like trying to solve 1,000 puzzles while each keeps changing its rules." Word of Wright's theory spread quickly through the bunker. Scientists who had been working on separate projects gathered around her station, offering refinements and calculations. A Nelvari researcher suggested using their species' psionic transmitters to add emotional content to the confusion signals, something the purely logical swarm would have no framework to process. A Drex weapons specialist proposed synchronizing weapons fire with the broadcast patterns to target the swarm during its moments of confusion. For 6 straight hours, the team worked to develop what they called Operation Contradiction. The plan took shape. Reprogram the human defense network to broadcast millions of conflicting signals, fragment the swarm, then guide the separated pieces toward a prepared trap. When they finally presented the plan to Admiral Miller, Dr. Tev spoke for the group. "It is unorthodox," the Alturi scientist admitted. But Dr. Wright's analysis appears sound. The swarm's greatest strength, its adaptive ability, depends on clear pattern recognition. If we deny it that clarity. Miller studied the proposal. This plan doesn't try to destroy the swarm through force. No, Wright confirmed. We can't beat it that way. But we can confuse it, split it, and redirect it. Using the defense network we built years ago, Miller noted. The one the Council called paranoid overkill. Wright allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes paranoia is just good preparation. As the scientists returned to finalize their preparations, Dr. Tev approached Wright privately. "I must confess something," the Alturi said quietly. "When we first met, I thought humans' obsession with backup systems and redundancy was inefficient, a sign of primitive thinking." Wright looked up from her work. And now, Dr. Tev's silver skin shimmered with what might have been embarrassment. "Now I see that what we called cowardice was actually wisdom. You prepare for failure not because you expect to fail, but because you refuse to be defeated by it." Wright nodded. An old human saying goes, "Hope for the best, prepare for the worst." We Alturi only did the first part, Dr. Tev admitted. Perhaps that is why we now need the humans to help us survive. Commander Tom Wilson stood on the bridge of the UES Defender, watching as thousands of signal beacons activated across the sector. Each one glowed as a tiny dot on the massive tactical display, forming a web that stretched across 3 star systems. "Operation Contradiction is live," reported Lieutenant Payton, who had been with Wilson since that first contentious council meeting that now seemed a lifetime ago. "All beacons transmitting on randomized frequencies." Wilson nodded. "And the swarm's position?" "Approaching the outer marker, sir. 12 minutes until contact with the first beacon array." Around them, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency. The Defender led a fleet of 400 ships, the largest force they had been able to assemble from the remnants of the Confederation Navy. But unlike the first battle, this fleet wasn't positioned for direct combat. They were there to shepherd the swarm, not fight it. "Status report from Allied vessels," Payton announced. "The Drex battle group is in position near the Hermes Gap. Alturi sensor ships have deployed along the neural corridor. Nelvari psionic transmitters are at full power." Wilson allowed himself a moment to appreciate how much had changed. The same species that had once mocked humanity's defensive approach now followed a human battle plan without question. "The swarm has made contact with the first beacon array," a sensor officer called out, reading fluctuations in its outer shell. All eyes turned to the main screen. The void swarm appeared as it always did, a massive, shifting darkness that consumed everything in its path. But as it encountered the first wave of contradictory signals, something changed. Its smooth movement became jerky. Sections pulled in different directions as if confused. "It's working," Payton whispered. Wilson kept his face neutral. "Stay focused. This is just phase 1. As the swarm pushed deeper into the trap, more beacons activated. Each broadcast a different set of signals, some mimicking Confederation ships, others resembling small planets, still others sending nonsensical data patterns that the swarm tried and failed to categorize. The Nelvari psionic transmitters added another layer of confusion, broadcasting emotional content that the purely logical swarm had no framework to process. For a creature that understood the universe through patterns, this chaos was paralyzing. "The swarm is fragmenting," reported the sensor officer. "Breaking into, 17 major segments and dozens of smaller ones. Wilson leaned forward. Signal the fleet. Begin Phase 2. The Allied ships moved in perfect coordination, not to attack the swarm but to guide its fragmented sections. Using precisely calibrated energy pulses, they created pathways of least resistance, channels that the confused swarm fragments followed instinctively. Fragment 7 is deviating from the planned route, warned the tactical officer. Increase signal strength in sectors 12 through 14. Wilson ordered calmly. The Alteri sensors should be able to direct it back. For 3 tense hours, the dance continued. The fleet guided the increasingly disorganized swarm fragments like shepherds directing a scattered flock. Their destination, an uninhabited star system designated as Trap Point Alpha. Last fragment entering the target system, Peyton reported finally. All swarm components accounted for. Wilson took a deep breath. Activate the gravity amplifiers. Years ago, humans had placed massive gravity generators around an unstable star in this remote system, another excessive precaution that had drawn mockery from the Confederation. Now those generators powered up simultaneously, creating a gravity well too powerful for even the swarm to escape. The fragments of the void swarm, still unable to reconnect properly due to the continuing signal interference, were pulled inexorably toward the star. The unstable sun, its delicate balance disrupted by the gravity amplifiers, began to brighten ominously. All ships, maximum safe distance, Wilson ordered. Prepare for solar event. The fleet withdrew to the edge of the system just as the star erupted in a massive flare. The concentrated energy washed over the trapped swarm fragments, breaking them down to their base components. On the Defender's bridge, the crew watched in silence as their sensors confirmed what seemed impossible. The void swarm was being contained and neutralized. Messages began flooding in from across Confederation space, reports of celebration, of relief, of gratitude. The Council requested Wilson's immediate presence for an emergency session. As the Defender set course for Confederation headquarters, Peyton approached her commander. "They're calling it the greatest victory in Confederation history," she said, offering him a rare smile. Wilson shook his head. It wasn't a victory through strength. It was survival through preparation. "Isn't that what humans have always done best?" Peyton asked. Wilson looked at the tactical display, where the beacon network, built years before it was needed, maintained despite ridicule, still glowed softly. "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "But the real lesson is simpler. In a dangerous universe, sometimes those who others call cowards are simply those who respect the dangers enough to prepare for them." As the ship accelerated toward a future that now existed because of human foresight, Wilson allowed himself to hope that the Confederation had learned this lesson well. Sometimes the most courageous act wasn't standing one's ground. It was making sure there would always be ground to stand on.